All right, welcome back. Today we are covering Amkor, FormFactor, and Axcelis. Does anyone know what those are? I didn't. They are very small semiconductor companies, and maybe Nick can explain a little bit why we're actually doing these companies today.
So maybe just to get everyone up to speed, because we've had a ton of new subscribers here in the last couple of days. Welcome, everyone. We have put together this semiconductor industry flowchart. I should say Kasey put together the semiconductor industry flowchart. And part of our thesis for investing specifically in semiconductor manufacturing equipment companies, this little space right here in the middle, is that we believe in the coming years, when legislation like the US CHIPS Act, that's the $52 billion geared towards chip manufacturing and research, similar stuff happening in Japan and South Korea, they're dumping lots of money into chip manufacturing. Of course, Taiwan, which dominates the space, Europe working on its version of the CHIPS Act. We think a lot of these profits will accrue to semiconductor equipment companies. So these are critical to the industry. They're kind of also semiconductor adjacent businesses because really they're industrialists. They don't really design or make the chips. They just make the equipment for the fabs themselves. And nevertheless, we're kind of putting together, I guess you could say, an index of these companies. The industry is dominated by five very large businesses, but there's a ton of smaller players that range everywhere from like the front end manufacturing of the wafers themselves, those are the big silicon discs, all the way to the back end manufacture of the chips. That's when the wafer gets chopped up into little chips and then packaged and then tested. So tons of companies involved in these many dozens of steps. And to my knowledge, and to your knowledge, I don't think there's an index out there that covers this very special niche of the semiconductor industry. There's my long-winded, ridiculous explanation as to why we're doing these three companies today. Before continuing, let me remind you to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if this video is helpful as you do your own investment research and increase your knowledge of business and technology. We really appreciate the support, as subscribing to the channel helps us continue putting out content like this.
Thanks, Nick. That clears up a lot of questions for me and probably for some of the viewers. But we do know that a lot of our subscribers know about these small semiconductor companies. So hopefully this is geared towards those who may not know about them, and then also you who are watching who are very knowledgeable about these areas. So we're going to start it off with Amkor Technology. So Amkor Technology is the leading provider of outsourced semiconductor packaging and test services. This company's been around for quite a while, founded in 1968. So maybe we can just briefly do an overview, Nick, of this company, where it fits into the semiconductor industry flow, and what are some of its products and services?
Okay, yes. So Amkor does a lot of the back end packaging. So that's after the wafer, the front end manufacturing. That refers to creating all those little microscopic patterns on the actual silicon wafer. So Amkor takes over basically after that. So the wafer gets chopped up, and then they help package the individual chips into some sort of computing chip system. So packaging, we think, is going to be a big deal in the coming years. A lot of companies like Intel and AMD and NVIDIA experimenting with this chiplet architecture. We've talked about this over on the Semi Investing and More podcast with Jose. So all sorts of stuff going on here: wire bonding, die attach, and then testing of the chip systems overall.
Maybe we could do an overview of the financial performance in the last year, and then maybe we can discuss some of the outlook for 2023. We do have a slide here from the recent investor presentation. You can see that there's a 16% year-over-year revenue in 2022, but as you can see, relatively thin margins here, about 10 to 12%. So some of Amkor's Technologies competitors include ASE Technology Holding, Jabil Circuit, and Samsung Electronics. And before we go into how that affects this company, let's talk a little bit about the revenue breakdown and the segments that Amkor Technology serves.
Yeah, pretty diverse revenue segmentation here. So some big competitors you mentioned, Kasey, especially Samsung, but Amkor has some pretty big customers as well. So like Intel, Philips, some of Japan's technology giants like Sony and Toshiba all count Amkor as a partner. Interestingly, last year, Amkor also joined Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing's 3D Fabric Alliance to kind of help create a closer collaboration, I guess, between multiple companies working on packaging, chip packaging, assembly, and testing. So that actually could be an interesting thing to watch in the coming years. But you put together this nice slide on the specific revenue breakdown. So communications last year, by far the biggest end market, automotive and industrial and consumer, both at about 20% of revenue, and then more general computing, like for data centers and such. So pretty diversified business, should benefit from secular growth trends within the industry as everything from data centers and AI to the automotive market kind of picks up steam in the coming decade.
Okay, and for the next slide, we have the financial strength here for the EBITDA margins, 20%, cash and short-term investments, 1.2 billion, and their total debt is 1.2 billion. So that's a wash.
Yeah, I think, Kasey, this is a good slide you pulled because I think it highlights a reason that I've kind of steered clear of companies like Amkor, and I know like Jabil Circuit has gotten a lot of investor attention. Back-end manufacturing is capital intensive. It costs a lot of money. Thus the debt and basically liquidity being roughly even at the end of 2022, tends to have thin profit margins on average. During boom times, those profit margins will expand, like you can see here. But then when there's like periods of downturn, those margins will shrink quite a bit. We'll see how that plays out because 2023 will more than likely be a down year for Amkor. Average analysts think probably a high single-digit revenue decline for 2023. And those EBITDA margins will probably drop. But we'll see how this plays out because free cash flow could actually make a huge rally this year because the company has been investing in some next-gen packaging and manufacturing technology. So I think that's kind of like my concern, basically, as far as the outlook goes for 2023 and why some of the back-end packaging companies like Amkor are ones that we historically have not really invested in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And during the investor presentation, the CEO mentioned that they really expect, as all semiconductor companies know right now, there's going to be a soft, low-end smartphone, PC, consumer wearables, the computing market. All of those markets are going to be pretty soft in 2023. But it sounded to me like they were really trying to put their eggs in the basket of automotive. What do you think about that? Like, what is going to be the outcome of that?
For certain, I think that will be one of the lone growth markets in 2023 for a lot of chip companies. But then headed into 2024, I think we could have something similar like what happened with consumer electronics this year. Supply kind of catches up with weakening consumer demand. And then there's like a glut of inventory. And then this automotive market kind of collapses for a bit. But then again, consumer electronics could, kind of swoop in and save the day next year too, if they rebound like the expectation is and kind of offset automotive. At any rate, probably too soon to tell. But by and large, we should probably just expect significant downturn in revenue for Amkor in 2023.
Okay, so let's talk about valuation for Amkor Technology. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it looks cheap, less than 8 times trailing 12-month earnings, although on a free cash flow basis, it's over 30. But again, expectation that free cash flow probably rebounds in pretty grandiose fashion in 2023. Earnings are probably going to come down, though, along with revenue. So again, this is a highly cyclical business. I wouldn't get lured in by the seemingly cheap price tag. I think if chip packaging is something that interests you, like it does us, I think this is kind of a wait and see stock at this point. And I don't have a price target on it either. Sorry. This is one that I think we just kind of need to see how things play out, because it's a cyclical business and there's some unknowns coming down the pike in 2023.
Yeah, this company seems like a wait and see. It looks like they're definitely pushing on with plans. They mentioned in the earnings call their factory construction in Vietnam is going as planned, but they did also mention that they had a few hiccups with the foreign currency rate swings and increased tax expenses. So obviously there's a lot of factors at play here. So I think this is a wait and see. Okay, moving on to company number 2, FormFactor, FORM. Let's talk about where this company fits into the semiconductor industry and what products they produce.
Okay, so this is another, again, chip manufacturing equipment company. FormFactor, 3/4 of their revenue comes from a type of test equipment that basically they're called probe cards. So after a wafer or sometimes even a chip system has been manufactured, there's these machines, and you get like these, I guess you could call them plates, with electrical circuits on them that kind of make contact with the wafer, and then electric current flows through it, and it tests the wafer for failure. And this is important because, faulty semiconductor wafers, silicon wafers, can be expensive if they're not caught soon enough in the process. So FormFactor, an important player here. Again, they make the systems and the probe cards themselves, which are a consumable product. They have a limited lifespan. You can only use them so many times. And so it's kind of like a recurring revenue stream, almost, you could say, within the chip equipment space. So kind of a unique business here as far as that goes.
FormFactor is also dabbling in this other interesting space, quantum cryogenics. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I recently did a write-up on FormFactor specifically about this. So I said basically those probe cards and probe card systems, the test systems, are 3/4 of business. The other 1/4 is the systems business. So lumped within the systems themselves are these cryogenic systems. And if you have at all heard about quantum computers, perhaps you've heard that a quantum computing system, so it needs to be kept at close to absolute zero Kelvin, or negative 273 degrees Celsius. So very cold, a very specialized system. And interestingly, I think maybe a lot of investors that perhaps follow a company called Kasey Technologies and SkyWater Technology, which is kind of a startup semiconductor fab business in the US. SkyWater Technology used a system co-developed by FormFactor and Kasey Technologies for their cryogenic lab. So again, quantum computers, as well as like some novel semiconductor materials that need to be tested at absolute zero to kind of cancel out some of the background noise that can be caused by thermal energy. Super nerdy stuff, but it's really cool. And I think this And I think this could actually be, over time, a big difference maker for FormFactor, because the probe cards are actually very low margin, gross margin business, like mid 30% gross margin at best. But the systems revenue has a gross margin of over 50%. So FormFactor, very, very small business here. And if you think quantum computers could eventually kind of augment classical computers in, say, a decade or more from now, this might be one to kind of pay some attention to once in a while.
Another two dynamics that are possibly going to help FormFactor is, of course, the growth of the semiconductor industry as a whole. But it also is interesting, the slowing of Moore's law could also help with this company continue to grow. Can you explain why this would be the case?
So, like we briefly touched on with Amkor, one of the ways chip designers are sort of extending the increase of computing power is by adopting new packaging techniques. So Amkor has a lot of probe card technology that can help test not just the wafers themselves, but also the chip systems, and help test for failure after they've been packaged together. So a lot of applications for this. You pulled some slides here from a recent presentation that showed, again, some of these like chiplet architectures, like multiple tinier chips interconnected with each other on a single system, and a lot of other new use cases like 5G network infrastructure are helping drive new probe card use. So a lot of chip manufacturers kind of retooling, and whenever there's like a big retooling, a big upgrade cycle, you've got to buy new probe cards. So that's what's going on with FormFactor, the bulk of its business.
And then we do have a couple of slides here. The first, customers that are over 10% of the total revenue. You see companies, big name companies like Intel, Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. So they have some very big customers who produce massive amounts of chips. And then the next slide, by market segment, you can see foundry and logic, DRAM chips, flash, and systems make up the bulk of their revenue. So let's talk a little bit about financial performance of this company in the past, and then maybe we can talk about valuation.
Okay, so again, this is another one that is likely to take a hit. Actually, they've already started to take a hit in revenue at the tail end of 2022. You can see actually a little bit of this in the slide you just shared, Kasey, with their customers that are greater than 10% of revenue. Intel is fairly consistently over 10%, but you can see the variability there, anywhere from like the high teens to a low 20% of their quarterly revenue. And then the other three, Samsung, SK Hynix, both of them in South Korea, TSMC, of course, in Taiwan, kind of dipping, kind of playing like it's almost like, it looks like a whack-a-mole arcade game here, with who's popping up on the 10% or greater list and then who's not. This company is, again, very cyclical, and because of the chip downturn, it's hitting FormFactor. We don't know exactly how much their revenue will dip in 2023. I'm thinking at the very least a high single-digit percentage drop, which is going to make for an even bigger, more pronounced drop in profitability. So it's a good thing for the industry. Whenever there's a chip downturn, companies might take the opportunity to retool for the next gen chips coming out. And when they do so, eventually they're going to need those probe cards from FormFactor. But in the interim, FormFactor and companies like it kind of end up taking it on the chin, I guess you could say. So this is another one I think is kind of a wait and see, I think, right?
Yeah, makes total sense. I don't think I've seen anything in the financials or anything we've discussed that really compels me to be a buyer of this stock right at this moment, but it's definitely an interesting business and has a lot of potential. All right, now for our last company, ACLS Technologies. And this one is quite small, from what I understand. They make ion implantation machines for the semiconductor industry. What exactly are those machines, Nick?
Kind of a weird name, right? Okay, so the last two companies, Amkor and FormFactor, kind of dabble on the back end of chip manufacturing. Axcelis is on the front end process of the manufacturing. So that's when companies, chip fabs, take the silicon wafer, those big discs that you see people holding in lab suits, and they turn them into, they make patterns on them basically. And eventually those discs with the little patterns and electrical circuitry etched into it and copper wiring in it, eventually those get chopped up into chips. So ion implantation is a specific step where basically elements other than silicon are introduced into the wafer to help augment the electrical conductivity of the wafer itself. And there's various reasons why a chip designer might want to do that. Oftentimes, it's for a special type of chip that maybe has to do with electrical conductivity. So maybe we can talk about that here in a moment as to what is driving Axcelis's growth. Throwing up the slide here that we keep using from Applied Materials. Again, this is the front-end wafer manufacturing process. And you can see from the slide here, kind of in the middle right side, CMP, thermal, and implant. Those three kind of narrow bars there. Applied Materials in blue. Basically about half or more of that market. So Axcelis would be part of the gray section there. So they compete against Applied Materials, the big heavy hitter in this ion implantation market.
On the news section of the investor website for Axcelis, they announced the shipment of their 500th Purion ion implanter. So what is this? What does that mean? What is that in relation to the market share from Applied Materials?
It means Axcelis is super tiny and they could pick up a lot of market share in this ion implantation market because they're kind of a specialist. Applied is a very diversified company. They're a generalist. Axcelis is a specialist. Ion implantation and related services for fabs that use their equipment, that's squarely what they are focused on. Very small company.
Okay. And from the looks of the next two slides that we have, as you said, this is their company, this Purion ion implantation device, and that is where they see the growth here. You can see the total addressable market for this has doubled in the last 3 years. And as you can see on the second slide here, mature market segments are accounting for greater than 60% of the implant total addressable market.
Okay, so that's an important point. That's what I was alluding to a moment ago with some of the specialized chips that deal with perhaps electrical conductivity that are helping drive Axcelis's expansion as of late. So these mature chips, you can think of these as like, the non-logic chips that help drive the AI systems in data centers, or like the chips that go into our advanced high-end smartphones. Mature chips are more like tried and true markets like automotive, industrial, maybe energy grid infrastructure. And it's interesting, these Purion machines, Axcelis has been selling like hotcakes in the last year. They're actually expecting a lot more growth over the next 2 to 3 years. They just hit roughly $1 billion in sales last year. They see being able to expand to roughly $1.3 billion. And specifically for 2023, roughly half of these machines they're selling are going to these mature markets, like for automotive. And of those, half of them are going to be specifically for silicon carbide, SiC. So kind of the trendy buzzword in semiconductors these days that we kind of get nervous about, I guess you could say, a little bit. Silicon carbide chips. That is like a perfect example of where ion implantation is important. You want to introduce basically an impurity into the silicon wafer to enhance electrical conductivity. So that's where a lot of this growth is coming from for Axcelis.
Silicon carbide device market is supposed to grow at a greater than 30% CAGR over the next roughly a decade. So that's where Axcelis is really betting heavy. Let's talk a little bit about this company's financial performance for last year and then going forward.
Okay, so you've got the slide here for 2022 results. $1 billion in sales, huge growth in revenue and earnings over the last year. Again, it's a small company, so whenever you have growth for a small company, especially something tied to manufacturing, you get those even bigger boosts to profit margins, kind of what you want to see in a small cap investment, right? This is what makes for market beating small cap stocks over the long term. For 2023, it looks like the company is going to grow again. It's a very general outlook, though. Revenue of at least $1 billion. And probably there's going to be some earnings growth along the way. I would say if Axcelis does end up growing, earnings per share probably going to go up more than revenue. But we don't know how much, right? This is going to be driven, again, by automotive and probably energy grid infrastructure. A lot of companies scooping up these ion implant machines for silicon carbide and other mature chip manufacturing applications. So this year, I feel like of the three companies we just talked about, this one definitely has the best near-term prospects for sure. There's a really good chance this thing continues to grow at a strong pace for 2023, strong earnings per share growth this year. And then again, like I mentioned just a moment ago, over the next 2 to 3 years, they see revenue reaching $1.3 billion. And again, earnings growth along the way. That's I'd say that's a pretty decent outlook.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of opportunity there. So tell me a little bit about valuation for this company currently.
This is where we're maybe not quite ready to go shopping yet. Certainly not calling this stock expensive by any means. However, shares did run up. The shares did basically more than double in the last year. Year to date, the stock is up almost 60% as of this recording, basically because of the outlook that they provided and all of this interest going into automotive technology and silicon carbide. As far as specific valuation, though, shares do trade for about 23 times trailing 12-month earnings and 21 times free cash flow. Again, not expensive, but for a chip equipment stock that could eventually hit some sort of temporary downturn, like the other two that we've been talking about, and largely a lot of these companies in the industry are going to run into in 2023. This is like maybe just a skosh above fair value, I think, at the moment. So of the three we've talked about today, this one's definitely at the top of the list. When I first kind of reviewed it over a year ago, that's when I should have bought it. But, such is life. It's still on the watch list, and we'll take a look at maybe nibbling on this one soon.
And we have done a number of videos about Applied Materials on our channel. It's a favorite stock of ours. How would you compare your willingness to purchase Axcelis against Applied Materials?
So again, Applied Materials is the generalist. They do a lot of other things other than ion implantation. Here's that slide again from Applied Materials on the wafer fabrication process, and you can see all that blue across the board. One reason we like Applied Materials is they they cater to both advanced chip manufacturing as well as the mature chip manufacturing as well. And so in a bad year for mature chips, a lot of these companies retooling, a lot of the fabs retooling and getting ready for the next wave of chip innovation, a lot of companies may get hit by that, but Applied Materials can actually just kind of pivot and focus its attention on its backlog of mature chip equipment. And so they may not grow as quickly as Axcelis does this year, but I do think they will grow after having maybe a slight downturn the first half of 2023. I think there's a good chance earnings per share grows, and a really good chance free cash flow rebounds quite a bit because of that buildup of backlog. And so Applied Materials is a bit cheaper, only 15 times trailing 12-month earnings, 24 times free cash flow. But again, I think there's this expectation Applied delivers a big run-up in free cash flow this year. So I prefer Applied Materials right now. This is actually one of our top chip stocks that we're buying because I think it's cheap, and it's still going to do pretty well this year.
Okay, very good argument for Applied Materials. But honestly, we have 3 companies here that are pretty interesting and we should keep on the radar. Amkor Technology, FormFactor, and Axcelis, all really interesting companies in the semiconductor industry.
Yes, and keep an eye out for our index of chip manufacturing equipment companies, because this is again dominated by 5 big ones. One of them Applied Materials, ASML Holding, Tokyo Electron, Lam Research, and KLA Corp, but then a very, very large number of smaller ones. So we are working on putting together that little index, and this is just maybe a sampling of 3 of them, I guess, right?
Exactly. So please stay tuned, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video. Link in the description if you want to leave us a tip from coffee, and please come back again. We'll see you again soon.